Kethavari Admiral Silrix had watched 17 civilizations surrender. He knew what defeat looked like before the losing side did. He stood at the observation deck of the command vessel Dominion's Grace, his four upper eyes scanning the holographic battle projection, while his lower pair studied the human fleet that had just dropped out of FTL on the edge of the Karax system. 31 ships. He counted them twice, because the number seemed too small to be intentional. 31 ships against his coalition of 412. The Asavari destroyers alone outnumbered them 6-1. His tactical AI had already calculated the engagement outcome to 4 decimal places, a 99.2% probability of total human annihilation within 14 standard minutes. Silrix allowed himself a slow exhale through his gill slits. Satisfying, that number. Clean. The human vessels were strange to look at, angular, asymmetric, covered in what the intelligence reports called reactive ablative plating, which the Kethavari scientists had dismissed as primitive heat shielding. Their drive signatures were loud, inefficient by coalition standards. Their communications were encrypted, but the encryption was a generation behind what his signals team could crack in minutes. Everything about them suggested a species that had stumbled into interstellar war before they were ready. Everything, except one thing. Silrix's secondary analyst, a young Kethavari named Thival, had flagged something in the pre-engagement briefing. A single data point that didn't fit the pattern. Silrix had dismissed it then. He would spend the rest of his life wishing he hadn't. "Admiral," Thival said from the sensor station, his crest feathers rising in a display that meant unease. "The lead human vessel is not moving into formation. It's waiting." Silrix turned to look. The largest human ship, a vessel his intelligence files labeled KSV Relentless, sat motionless at the center of the human formation. No evasive drift, no shield cycling, no targeting lock transmissions, just stillness. What does a species that builds asymmetric warships and uses outdated encryption think it is waiting for? The KSV Relentless had a crew of 412 humans, which Silrix would later find bitterly poetic, one for every ship in his coalition. Its commanding officer was a woman the crew called simply the Commander. Her name was Avery, though the name appeared nowhere in her service record's first 40 pages, buried under 14 years of classified operations, 3 court-martial proceedings that were each quietly dissolved, and a psychological evaluation that had been redacted so thoroughly that only the final line remained visible to anyone without a Tier 9 clearance. That line read, "Subject demonstrates atypical response suppression under extreme duress. Not recommended for standard command. See secondary file." The secondary file was sealed by order of the UFS High Command. Avery stood at the forward viewport of the Relentless and did not look at the tactical display. She looked at the stars. She had a habit of doing this that unnerved her crew, not because it seemed irrational, but because of what always happened immediately after. Like she was listening to something in the dark between the lights. Her executive officer, a compact man named Shane who had followed her through 2 campaigns and a nightmare on Nexareth Station, approached from the starboard console and stopped a precise arm's length away. He knew her geometry of silence. He'd learned it the hard way. "Coalition fleet is holding at 400 kilometers, he said. "No advance. They're scanning us." "I know," she said. "Our forward analysis puts their rail battery count at approximately 9,000 individual emplacements across the fleet. If they fire simultaneously—" "They won't," she said. Shane paused. He had learned not to ask, "How do you know?" because the answer was always something that made him feel like he'd been looking at a map upside down for years. "Estimated time to their patience running out?" Avery finally turned from the viewport. Her eyes were the specific gray of deep ocean water, and they carried the same quality of pressure. 6 minutes, she said. "Tell Caleb to warm up the breachers." Shane went very still. "All of them?" She had already turned back to the stars. The Relentless was, officially, a heavy cruiser. Unofficially, in the sealed technical annexes of the UFS Weapons Development Directorate, it was a proof-of-concept vessel for a weapons philosophy that had no precedent in any alien military doctrine encountered by humanity in 30 years of interstellar contact. The Kethavari had weapons that disrupted molecular cohesion. The Asavari had mass drivers that could punch through 6 meters of composite armor. The Nexovani, the third member of the coalition, had developed a gravitational shear weapon that could split a ship at the structural seam. Humanity had looked at all of these and done something that no alien military theorist had predicted. They had gone sideways. Entirely, deliberately, philosophically sideways. The breachers were the result. 6 minutes and 4 seconds after Avery's estimate, not approximately but exactly, The Osavari destroyer wing broke formation and began its attack run. It happened fast. That was the Osavari doctrine, the thunderstroke, the overwhelming opening salvo that collapsed enemy will before defensive systems could fully cycle. 217 destroyers accelerating at 14G, their mass drivers charging, their point defense grids singing with targeting acquisition. The telemetry that Thivel was watching from the Dominion's Grace showed it as a single, gorgeous red wave rolling toward 31 stationary human ships. Silrix watched it with the quiet pleasure of a craftsman watching a well-made tool do its work. Then he noticed the human fleet still wasn't moving. Not evasion, not formation shift, not even shield consolidation. The 31 ships sat precisely where they had been, and the only change across the entire human formation was a subtle shift in the electromagnetic profile of the Relentless, a bloom of energy that his sensors didn't have a classification for. "What is that emission?" he asked. Thivel was already working it. "Unknown. It doesn't match any known drive, weapon, or shield technology. The frequency profile is..." He stopped. "Is what?" "Admiral, the profile matches nothing in our database. Not ours, not Osavari, not Nexavani. I'm checking the xenological archive for any species we've ever cataloged, and I'm finding..." Another pause, longer this time. "Nothing." The Osavari destroyers were 60 seconds from optimal firing range. The Relentless fired first. What the external cameras on the Dominion's Grace recorded was a visual artifact that the Kethavari Optical Processing Lab would spend 11 months analyzing. It looked like a color that didn't exist. Not black, not any frequency of light, but an absence that had shape. It had shape the way a wound has shape. It left the Relentless in a tight beam approximately 3 meters in diameter, and it struck the lead Osavari destroyer, a vessel massing 400,000 tons, and that destroyer simply stopped. Not exploded. Not disabled. Stopped. As if time itself had decided the ship was no longer worth the effort of continuing. Then the ship came apart in a sphere of silent white light that expanded at exactly the speed a physicist would calculate if they understood what had hit it, which no physicist in the coalition did. Silence on the bridge of the Dominion's Grace. Then the Relentless fired again. Caleb ran the breacher array from a room that smelled of ozone and hot copper and a faint sweetness that he had stopped trying to identify in year 2 of the program. He was 31 years old. He had a degree in quantum topological engineering from MIT and a secondary credential in what his thesis supervisor had called energetic discontinuity applications, which was academic language for things that shouldn't be possible, but seemed to work anyway. He had 17 breachers under his hands. Each one required a continuous, conscious adjustment. They were not fire-and-forget weapons. They were instruments, and he played them the way a surgeon plays a patient's biology, with attention and intention and a stillness at the center that his colleagues found unsettling in a man his age. The principle behind a breacher was elegant in the way that a correctly written proof is elegant. It doesn't disrupt matter. It doesn't deliver energy. What it does is locate the specific quantum state vector that describes the coherent existence of a target object, and it applies a lateral displacement to that vector, sideways in terms of probability space. The target doesn't cease to exist so much as it ceases to exist here. Where it goes instead is a question that Caleb had written 40 pages about, and whose conclusion remained classified. The practical result was that a breacher strike on a 400,000-ton destroyer produces an energy release equivalent to a 40 megaton detonation, because that is how much energy is stored in the molecular bonds of that much matter, and when the matter's coherence vector is displaced, those bonds release simultaneously and completely. In the 17 minutes that followed the first shot, Caleb fired the array 63 times. His hands moved with a precision that his EEG readouts would later show was accompanied by a brain state indistinguishable from deep meditation. Shane watched from the doorway for 3 minutes and then quietly left, because watching Caleb work felt like watching something that shouldn't be witnessed by ordinary attention. 63 shots, 63 kills, 0 misses. A kill ratio that had no comparison in any human or alien military record, because no prior weapon had operated on the same underlying physics. The Osavari destroyer wing ceased to exist as a functional fighting force in 11 minutes and 40 seconds. The remaining ships broke and turned. They were not running. That was the first thing Silrix forced himself to register, because his initial instinct was to see the Osavari retreat as cowardice, and Silrix had not lived this long by letting his instincts go unexamined. The Osavari were not cowards. They were repositioning, which meant they were adapting, which meant they had observed something in those 11 minutes that their tactical doctrine could incorporate. He pulled Thivel's analysis. The young officer had been running numbers continuously since the first shot, and his crest feathers were now flat against his skull, which was the Kethavari equivalent of a human going pale. "Tell me," Silrix said, The weapon shows no targeting signature we can detect, no energy buildup curve, no emission precursor. It fires and the target is destroyed without any of the intermediate steps that any weapon we know of requires. Thival's voice was steady, which impressed Silrix even now. Our point defense systems have nothing to track. They're designed to intercept projectiles, energy beams, or guided munitions. This is none of those things. He searched for the word. It's a result without a process. There's always a process, Silrix said. Yes, Thival agreed. We just can't see it. What Silrix didn't know, what no coalition intelligence asset had successfully extracted, was that the breacher array was not the reason Avery had positioned the Relentless at the center of the formation. It was not why she had waited. It was not why she had looked at the stars for 6 minutes rather than at the tactical display. The breacher was the answer to how. Avery was the answer to why it would work. The classified psychological evaluation, the one with the redacted pages and the single visible line about atypical response suppression, described a cognitive profile that UFS military researchers had discovered in approximately 0.003% of the human population. Individuals who process threat data not through the standard fear response pathway, but through a parallel system that the researchers had named, with characteristic scientific understatement, the Extended Threat Integration Network. In functional terms, it meant that Avery did not experience fear as an interruption to thinking. She experienced it as additional data. Every threat, every incoming weapon, every probability of death fed directly into her tactical processing rather than competing with it. The evolutionary pressures that had produced this trait in a small fraction of humanity were debated. The practical application was not. She had known, from the moment the Asavari wing began its run, exactly what Caleb would hit and in what order and what the fleet would look like in 11 minutes. She had also known something else. The Nexavani fleet moved. This was the second surprise, and it was the one Silrix had planned. While the Relentless and Caleb's breachers were dealing with the Asavari, the Nexavani Gravitational Shear Squadron, 28 vessels, the most technologically advanced ships in the coalition, had been cycling their shear generators on minimum power, staying below detection thresholds, maneuvering into a three-dimensional flanking position that would put them at optimal angles relative to every human ship simultaneously. It was a perfect trap. The Nexavani commander, a tactician named Dressa who had not lost an engagement in 9 years, triggered the shear array at precisely the moment her positioning algorithm indicated maximum effectiveness. 28 gravitational shear pulses fired simultaneously. They struck nothing. The human fleet had moved. Not evaded, moved. Every ship simultaneously, by exactly the distance required to be outside the shear effect's lethal radius, in a direction and by an amount that was not a guess and was not a fortunate accident. It was a response to a targeting solution that the Nexovani had developed over 4 days of careful positioning and had shared with no one outside their command network, which Avery had spent those same 4 days quietly reading. The UFS intelligence method she'd used was something else that wasn't in any alien database. It wasn't code breaking. It was what her brief called inferential trajectory mapping, a process by which, given sufficient data about how a culture makes decisions, you can reconstruct the decision they will make before they make it, not by accessing their communications, but by understanding them well enough that their tactics become predictable to you. Humanity had been studying the Nexovani for 9 years. They had 9 years of behavioral data, cultural analysis, tactical doctrine analysis, and the accumulated intuitions of several hundred xenopsychological researchers who had asked, continuously, one question. What will they do when they think they've won? The answer was exactly this. The human fleet's countermove cost the Nexovani their positioning advantage and left their ships in a distribution that Caleb's array was ideally suited to address. He addressed it with the calm attention of a man performing work he understood completely. 19 of the 28 Nexovani vessels were destroyed in 4 minutes. The remaining 9 retreated to the edge of the system. Silence. Thival was the one who said it, quietly, to no one in particular. They knew. Silrix had one move remaining. The Kethavari main fleet had not engaged. 300 ships, the finest vessels his civilization had ever built, each one carrying the gravitational mass disruptors and photon lattice weapons that had ended the Shinari resistance in 6 days and the Arxon 7 revolt in 3. He had held them in reserve because that was correct doctrine. You don't expose your primary force until the battlefield geometry is established. He had the geometry now. 31 human ships. Caleb's array had fired 63 times in the first engagement, and Silrix's analysts estimated the energy requirements would require a recharge interval of at minimum. Admiral, Thival said, His voice had changed. It had a quality Silrix didn't immediately recognize, and then did. It was the voice Tyval used when he was reporting facts he didn't believe. The relentless is signaling. A surrender request? Thival turned from his console. No, sir. They're asking if we want to talk. Silrix looked at the tactical display. 31 human ships, 300 of his own. The breachers would need time to recharge. They had to. The physics were clear. You could not fire a weapon 63 times in 11 minutes and fire it again immediately, not with any power generation technology that... The emission profile, Thival said, and now his voice was very quiet. The relentless. Its emission profile is not diminished. It's higher than before the engagement. The breachers had not needed to recharge. The 63 shots had not depleted the array. They had warmed it. Silrix sat down. He was not aware of making the decision to sit down. He became aware that he was seated because Thival was looking at him with an expression the young officer had never shown before. He opened the communication channel. Avery took the channel from the command chair. Shane stood to her left. Caleb had come up from the array room and stood at the back of the bridge, his hands at his sides, his expression the uncomplicated one of a person whose work is done. The rest of the bridge crew were quiet in the way of people who understand that something important is being decided. Admiral Silrix, she said. Her voice was not triumphant. It was the voice of someone doing an unpleasant but necessary thing with care. We don't want your fleet. We don't want your ships or your territory or any settlement that requires your surrender. A long pause on the channel. Then, what do you want? We want you to go home, she said, and we want you to take an accurate account of what happened here. We want the coalition to understand what they're choosing if they choose to continue this. Another pause. Why? Silrix asked. You could destroy us. This was the moment that Thival, watching from his station, would return to for the rest of his life. The moment he memorized because it explained something he hadn't understood about the species he'd been studying. Because destroying you doesn't get us what we want, Avery said, and because we're going to have to live in this part of the galaxy for a very long time, and we'd rather do it with neighbors than with ruins. The channel closed. The Kethavari main fleet did not advance. After 4 minutes and 30 seconds of stillness that Silrix would later describe as the most important 4 minutes of his command career, it turned. All 300 ships. Together. And it left. Thival filed his after-action report 17 standard days later. It ran to 412 pages, which Silrix would again find bitterly and perfectly poetic. The report covered the breacher array, the inferential trajectory mapping, the energy profile anomalies, and the psychological assessment data that the Coalition's intelligence services had managed to partially reconstruct from intercepted UFS documents. But the final section, the section that Thival wrote 3 times before he was satisfied with it, was about none of those things. It was about the moment after the battle ended, about what Avery had not said, about the 9 Nexavani ships still functional at the edge of the Karax system, which the Relentless had not pursued, about the Osavari survivors in escape pods that human rescue vessels had already begun to collect, about the fact that a species capable of firing 63 unanswered killing shots in 11 minutes had then spent the next 4 hours recovering the wounded of the fleet that had tried to destroy them. The Coalition had built its doctrine on a fundamental assumption about intelligent species under threat, that the first imperative of survival is the elimination of the threat. You secure the battlefield by ensuring no enemy remains capable of action. Every species the Kethavari had ever encountered, including themselves, followed this logic. Humanity had apparently decided, at some point in its history, that this logic was incomplete. Thival's report noted the human casualty count for the Battle of Karax. 0 killed, 7 injured, none critically. He noted the Coalition casualty count. 209 ships destroyed, estimated personnel losses in excess of 40,000. He noted the disparity, and then he did something that junior analysts rarely do in official reports. He asked what it meant. He asked why a species with those numbers, with that disparity, with weapons that the Coalition's best physicists had spent 17 days failing to explain, would choose to stop. He wrote the question, and then he sat looking at it for a long time. Then he wrote his answer. They stopped because they could, because the capacity to continue and the choice to stop are, for this species, not in conflict, because they have apparently mastered, or are in the process of mastering, something that our civilization has never successfully separated. The ability to be absolutely devastating and to choose, in the same moment, not to be. We assumed that power at this level would produce in them what it has produced in every species we have encountered: certainty of purpose, expansion of will, the appetite that comes with the ability to feed it. We were wrong. They are more dangerous than any species we have ever classified as dangerous, and they have declined to be dangerous to us today. These two facts are not contradictory. They are, I now believe, the same fact. We did not encounter a weapon today. We encountered a philosophy with weapons attached to it. I do not know what to do with that distinction. I suspect we will spend a very long time finding out. The report was classified at the highest Kethavari military level. Silrix read it twice, confirmed its classification, and then, in a decision he made alone, without consultation, in the quiet of his command quarters on the long voyage home, he sent an unmarked copy to the Kethavari Science Directorate, the Cultural Institute, and the office of the first speaker. He included no cover letter. He thought none was needed. Thivel never learned that Silrix had done this. He spent the next 11 years studying humanity, their history, their literature, their philosophy, the specific sequence of catastrophes and recoveries that had produced a species capable of atypical response suppression in a small fraction of its population, and, in the rest, a stubborn, empirically demonstrated preference for continuing. He became, in time, the leading Kethavari authority on human civilization. He gave lectures, he wrote monographs, he answered questions from politicians and generals and other analysts who wanted to know what humanity was. He always gave the same answer, and it was always the same thing Avery had said on that open channel in the Kerak system, which he had memorized so completely that it had stopped feeling like a memory and started feeling like a truth he'd always known. We'd rather do it with neighbors than with ruins. He never stopped being changed by it.